Hey guys, it's Jay Cini, and today I wanted to do a demo on what different shutter speeds look like on your camera. So let's say you're going out to shoot a video. You've heard around the place that there's a general rule to have your shutter speed as 1 over the number of frames a second you're shooting. So if you're shooting 25 frames a second like I am right now, the shutter speed should be 1 over 50. Now this is of course to get a certain amount of motion blur within your picture. And the reason that we have this motion blur is so that it looks a little bit more realistic to what the eye sees. So this goes for all frame rates. Let's say you're shooting in 50 frames a second, your shutter speed should be 1 over 100. If you're shooting in 24 frames a second, it should be 48. So that's the rule. There's many examples of people bending this rule and changing it to create a certain effect. So what I'm going to do now is give you a little bit of a demo of what different shutter speeds do. So right now I'm shooting in 25 frames a second and my shutter speed is 1 over 50. So you can see if I move my hand, there's a little bit of motion blur. You can sort of see a little bit of blur when I move my hands, and that kind of looks natural to what you'd expect to see in real life. Okay, so that's it. That's what the general rule is meant to be. Okay, so I'm still shooting in 25 frames a second, but what I've done now is I've changed the shutter speed to 25. So it's getting exposed about twice as long as it should be. So the entire frame is now getting exposed. And what you'll see is now there's a lot more motion blur, probably a bit too much. It starts to look a bit dreamy. Okay, so you can kind of see that on the camera now when there's a bit of movement. You won't notice it so much when there's not much happening, but the second you get some movement, you're going to get a lot more blur, and it just looks a little bit weird. So that's why a lot of people will not use this shutter speed. If you're trying to shoot something that looks a little bit dreamy, this might be the way to go. But as a general rule, you want to shoot at 50 if you're doing 25 frames a second. Okay, so once again, I'm still shooting at 25 frames a second. But now what I've done is I've changed the shutter speed to 1 over 100. So it's only getting exposed half the amount of time for each frame. So as you can see, my hand starts to look a little bit more jittery, and you can see every single movement, and there's not much blur at all. So this is something you might want to use if you're shooting a little bit more of an action sequence. Make things a little bit clearer. If things are moving really fast, you probably don't want to have heaps of blur because it might start to look really messy, and that's a good example of where you could perhaps make the shutter speed just a little bit faster, and that would improve the look of the film. So that's an example of where you could bump up your shutter speed just a little bit and improve the look of the footage. However, if you bump up too high, things are going to start to look really weird. Every single little movement you're going to see completely with no motion blur, and that's not something that you want. Okay, so I'm still shooting at 25 now, but what I've done is I've bumped the shutter speed up to 1 over 400. So now you can see that effect is even more pronounced, and it starts to look a little bit strange. There's no more motion blur at all. All you can see is each individual frame getting captured, which creates this really weird sort of effect which looks a little bit odd to the eye, which is why we don't use it much. So of course there are examples of people using these frame rates, but it's probably best to stick to 1 over 50. Okay, so now I've really bumped it up. Now I'm shooting 25 frames still, but my shutter speed is now 1 over 1600, so it's very fast, and you can see that that effect is just really weird. It looks really weird to the eye. So because you're not letting that much light into the camera because your shutter speed is so short, you're having to raise the ISO and the aperture to get enough light into the camera to expose for every single one of those. So you can see that things start to look really weird, and I can't think of an example where you'd probably use this. So I think the best thing we can do right now is get back to a shutter speed of 1 over 50. Okay, and we're back to 1 to 50, so you can see the motion blur is kind of back to normal. We're getting a little bit of blur, which is good. So I hope you guys found this useful, a bit of a demonstration of how different shutter speeds work. You can see that they do look vastly different, from really dreamy to really sort of static. So it's very important that you're using a good shutter speed, which is double your frame rate. If you stick to that, your footage is going to look really good, and that's why it's become a rule. So thank you guys for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. My name is Jay Cini, and we'll see you later.